Alright, I'm back. Welcome back to the Engineered Angler, and we're back at making this swim bait. Last time, which was part two, I had gotten this roughly shaped, and I started to get the more refined kind of tapered ends and the tapered edges, and started to do some shaping. Teaching people how to shape a lure is actually a little more difficult than the physics, believe it or not, because I think it's more about feel and being able to sight a good shape. So I'm not going to go into too much about shaping. I'll show you my technique, and I'll show you how I try to get a good uniform or symmetric shape along the center line lengthwise. So let me show you what I've done to get to this point.
So I always start with the belt sander. That thing's got 80 grit on it, and it takes a lot of material off. I check it after every pass, just to make sure I'm not making any weird divots. And I sight down the center line and along the edge of the lure, just to make sure I'm following the contour I want to be on. Here I'm taking advantage of the rounded end on the belt sander. And this way I can get on that inside curve at the head of the lure. When I'm pretty comfortable, I've got a good shape, I start in with some handwork. And this is just a piece of PVC with 100 grit sandpaper on it. Once I'm pretty comfortable that it's starting to take shape, I'll get the block sander out, and this has got about 220 on it. And it gets a little smoother. It gives me a better idea of how smooth and how clean the lines are. Now I'll use my hands to sort of feel across the lure and make sure that it's smooth, it doesn't have any divots or too much of a flat spot. And I'll do this back and forth a few times. So I'll give it a last look, sight down that center line, both top and bottom, and then I'll call it a day and maybe look at it again tomorrow.
So you can see I use a lot of machines and just a little bit of handwork to get it to the rough point. And then I begin my fine tuning with tools like this piece of PVC with a little bit of sandpaper in it. You saw me working out in the shop with, and that helped me round out the tops and bottoms. And by just rotating it, you can play with that radius a little bit. I also like to use these oversized nail files. I buy them in boxes of like 12 or 20. They're nice because they're flexible, and they have two different grits. They have 120 on one side and 220 on the other. And all those things lend a hand in getting the shape, but it's the shaper that actually gets it done correctly, because it's all about being able to sight down your lure and see if it's being shaped correctly. In other words, if you have symmetry from side to side and a nice uniform cross section as you taper out to the center of the body and then back into the tail. So you have to have a little bit of, I guess, ability to visualize shapes in 3D, but it actually is more practice than technique. Most people will take their lure blank, and this is just a block of wood that I've cut almost lure shaped, and they'll take a marker or a pencil or a pen, and they'll do a quick line, and they'll do this very quickly. It's really simple to do. And you end up with these nice guidelines. And you can do the same thing along the profile by just rocking it along the shape. And then you have what are chamfer lines. So here's a closer look. You end up with these chamfer lines, which basically gives you an indication of where to cut through to start to create that chamfer And then you can go ahead and sand it and get a nice round edge. Take your time while you're doing this, because if you hurry and you start making mistakes, you're going to end up chasing that mistake from side to side, and in the end you'll whittle it down to nothing. So now I'm going to go ahead and show you what I do to get a stencil on there so that I can begin to carve out the detail for the lips, the eye socket, and then the gill plates. So the next step is to apply my drawing. Remember this? This is my original drawing. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it still sort of fits, that I haven't lost too much of the dimensions that I originally started with, but still the width is just right and the contour at the head is perfect. So I can just use this template for my details. So let me show you what I do. Right, so the first thing I'm going to do is perforate this template along the lines that I want to transfer onto the blank. So I'm just using this little probe. It's just a pointy probe. You can use a sharpened nail, whatever you want. And what I'm going to do is over this nice soft kind of rubber surface. So just taking the probe, I'm going to poke in along those lines at about 1/16 inch intervals. And this will allow me to take the next step and transfer this detail to the blank itself. So I'm going to mark where I want the center of that eyeball. Well, I know I've got it perforated correctly when I can look through it and see all the details with light. So now I'm going to attach it onto the lure body, just using a little bit of this removable kids craft glue, and try to keep the glue away from the holes. So since this is black resin, I'm going to take a silver marker and I'm going to line out where the mouth parts are right across the top, so that I can later align it with the other side. Just a couple little lines. Right, now to the paint station. Alright, so let's take a little bit of white paint, and then I'm just going to go over the lines I want to make sure get exposed or transposed, however you want to look at it. Okay, that should do it. All right, and that is probably hard to see on camera, but I can clearly see where my lines are, and now I can just draw them in with the same ink pen. There you go, there's drawn in, and now I've just flipped it over, and I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Okay, so I've got the features that I want on there, and I'm going to go ahead and get started on the carving. My technique for carving is about as technical as my technique for shaping. I use every means available to me in my shop, so I might use the Dremel tool quite a bit. I'll use hand sanding tools. I'll use just razor knives, cut away material, sand away material, and I'll do it by eye. And again, this is not something I have a great technique at. If you want to see some really good carving techniques, check out SolarBaits. He's got some very nice videos on carving and some just spectacular detail on some of his lures. I'm going to get started and I'll give you a shot of this thing as we go along. Well, I still got a long way to go on this carving, and I don't want to belabor this video. So I'm going to come back after I've got all the facial features carved in, and I've got that eye socket drilled out, and then we'll start on the joints. All right, so I washed it down a little bit and I've got it pretty much carved how I want it. Hopefully this shows up. See some of the features. The eye sockets are in, the lips, and then the gill plates. All right, now I'm going to mark where I need to cut this thing. The final dimension on it is right at 6 3/4. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it 1/3 from the nose, but then I'm going to shorten up the tail section just a little bit, just to be sure I've got enough thickness in these two sections. So that's a full 1/3 from the head, and then 2 inches from the tail, and that'll leave me right about 2.5 inches for the rest of it. And I mismarked this guy right here. Okay, so I've drawn a nice line straight down the middle just to have a nice spot to eyeball a square and then lay in my cuts. And now it's time to give this thing over to the saw. So shaping these guys will be a few steps away. Let's take a look at the design for the actual hinge plates. So before we move on and actually install these, we have to shape these joints, and they have to be round, like this one. You see how that's round? So that it can rotate around it. And so we'll add a little bit of a natural radius there. So the next thing we need to decide is where this hole will be for the pin. Well, since this has to rotate around, that means that this distance has to be either the exact same as this distance or slightly more. I like to have it a little more just for safety's sake. We'll call this distance R because it's the radius, and then I want that distance to be R plus a 32nd of an inch. Let's go ahead and draw in the plate, how it might look. Now the distance between the back of this plate and the beginning of the pinhole has to be 3/32, just for strength. And it just turns out that the pin will be exactly 3/32 as well. Now we've got this distance here, and we just need to know how much clearance we want between the pieces. And I want about a 1/16 of an inch, so half of that will be a 32nd. Kind of a running theme here. So if I add all these up, I'll get half the length of my plate. And all I need to know is R. So R will be what I measure across the body there. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the thickest part, and I'm just going to make them all that size. This way I know they'll all move. There'll be a little bit of extra space on the narrower radiuses, but it'll all move smoothly and it should work pretty well. So let's go out to the shop and start cutting. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken a piece of scrap aluminum, and it's about 1.25 millimeters thick, and I've glued a piece down here, and I've already divided it into the widths that I want. The length I'll have to modify a little bit later, but it's pretty close. The next thing I want to do is position where my pins are going to be, and then hit it with a punch to mark it so I can then drill them out, and that's the next thing I'll do. Later on, I'll separate these out and then I'll round these edges off just a little bit so there aren't hard corners. But for right now, let's get the segments of the lure and round off those joint butts and make sure we can get that to work. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the belt sander. And I'm going to get these edges chamfered in pretty close. And then I'll come in with this little circular sand board and get the radius about perfect. It's pretty good for there. It should be pretty good right there. Okay, so I've got these things shaped and nicely rounded. The joints look pretty good. I didn't lose too much of my carving. Got back into it just a little bit, but not bad. So the next step is going to be to cut in the slots for the hinge plates. I'm going to have them the distance down from the top that I measured for the radius. So I'll just measure that radius and I'll pull it down, and then I'll put the other one up the same distance, and I'll do that on all of them. And on the very last one, since I'm only going to have one, I'll put it right in the center. I've got them marked. I'm going to go ahead and cut them in about a ½ inch, and then I'll clean that slot up a little bit with the Dremel tool. So since I'm only going to go down ½ inch on this cut, I'll go ahead and mark it on the saw. Okay, so I've got all these little tabs or the hinge plates done, and I've got all the slots cut in. Now I've already discovered a little bit of an issue. No build is without problems. So here's what I found. As I did the calculations for the weight and the volume of these pieces, I realized that this stuff is so light, it is so buoyant, that there may not be enough room in each of these segments to actually have enough lead in it to make it sink. That's problematic. I'm going to continue to move forward on this. I'll have to get creative getting lead in here. The other issue I found is the number 2 segment, which goes just behind the head, is just a little too narrow. I intended to add about a ¼ inch to this, and I was going to take it from the tail, but I neglected to do it. I've kind of forgot, and now I've got a really narrow piece where the cuts for the slots for these plates come within like a ¼ inch of each other, so I've got very little material in there. Worst case scenario, I've got a well carved head, the tail's the right size, and the third piece is the right size, and I might just have to go back and cut another piece out of wood and make this number 2 piece out of wood. So let's just keep on chugging here. I'm going to drill the holes for these hinge plates. The way I'm gauging the depth of the hole is by slipping in the tab and giving myself just a little bit, like a 30-second, and shifting it out and making a mark. And I've got a mark on the bottom and the top on this one, and I'm about ready to drill it. The way I'm trying to align these holes is I'm trying to make sure that it's centered on the center line and that it's parallel to the that edge right there. Alright, so we're making some progress on this build. I've got the 4 parts of that lure cut, shaped, and slotted for these hinge plates. I've calculated the amount of weight I'm going to need for this, and we're going to go into that calculation in a minute. I'm going to go to the whiteboard and we'll do that. I also decided that I'm going to scrap this one. This is the number 2 piece just behind the head. We've just lost a little too much material with these cuts. So what I've done is I've poured another slug of this resin in the same mold, just kind of truncated down to the 1.5 inches that I need, and I'll have to pull this apart and I'll show you what it looks like. A little bit of a flash under here is holding it down. There it goes. You can see it'll be about 3/8 of an inch bigger than this. That'll give me that 3/8 of an inch in here, right in the middle, and that allows me to get more strength out of this piece. Plus, it gives me some space to put some weights in. Speaking of weights, let's talk about weight and balance. Let's go to the dry erase board. Alright, let's talk about weight and balance. This lure build has been a lure build from hell. Everything's gone wrong. The camera has died on me. The microphone has died on me. And so I'm going unmiked, so hopefully the sound will be okay. But let's talk about weight and balance. Okay, so what I've done is I've individually weighed each one of these segments. And then I can take the weight of the individual segments and divide them by the density. And if you'll remember, I calculated the density from a small piece that I had cut off of that block of resin. And then I converted it to metric because it's just a lot easier to work with metric. So let's just do a quick example calculation. You can figure out the rest. The weight of the head segment is 9.71 grams. If you divide that by 0.413, you end up with a volume, which is 23.51 milliliters. So that would be the volume of the actual front section. So that also equals the amount of water it would display. And since water is 1 gram per milliliter, then we can just change this to grams. And that 23 grams is the weight of water it displaces. So therefore it is the weight that this body has to be neutrally buoyant. So just before it starts to sink. We have to remember that we have to include all the weight of all those pieces of hardware, the plates, that pin that runs through the plates, the hook that we're going to put on it, and the added ballast weight we have to get to go just slightly beyond the 23.51. So I'm going to weigh the hardware, and since it shares 2 of the plates, I'll just weigh 1 plate on here and the pin, and that comes out to 5.81 grams. We also have to account for the weight of the body as well, so that's 9.71 grams. The total weight of the body on all the hardware is 15.52 grams. Now, to know what we're going to add to it, the ballast weight we have to add to this segment, we just take the total weight that we knew we needed to get and subtract the 15.52. So that's 23.51 minus 15.52, 13.01 grams. So 13 grams.
So that's obviously wrong. It's 7.99, but we can round that up to 8.0.
Now, I need this thing to sink. I don't want it just to be suspending. And I like my swim baits to sink at about a foot per second, slightly more than that actually. As a rule of thumb, and this is from a bunch of experimentation, I typically take 10% of the total weight of that segment, so the 15.52. So I'm going to round that up and add 2 grams. So I know that I'm going to need to add 15 grams
So the actual number is 10 grams.
of lead to that segment. So let's talk about balance, because on swim baits, the distribution of the weight is really important. The principle here is to keep as much weight forward as you possibly can. If you'll remember from that first video where we tested multiple different lengths of swim baits, you'll notice that the movement goes backwards. In other words, the back 2 or 3 segments are the ones doing all the work. They're the ones moving the most. So those are the ones you want to keep the lightest, because remember, you don't want to have to fight inertia. And if you forgot what inertia is, it essentially is the heavier something is, the harder it is to get it to move, and the harder it is to get it to stop moving. 2 segments right here, the only thing I'm going to do is add enough weight to make them neutral. And then these 2 segments will be our driving force to actually get it to sink. Okay, there's one more really critical element that you need to know, is to figure out where exactly on this front of this lure do I put that tie-on eye. Because legitimately it can go anywhere from here, maybe even as high as that, depending on how well balanced the shape of your lure is. If you pull a line, an imaginary line, from where you believe the tie point would be all the way to this aft point, it should divide the lure area in half perfectly, or near perfectly. In other words, there would be the same amount of area as there is on top as there is on bottom. And what that does is it just equalizes the drag forces on your lure. And this way you don't have more drag above the line or below the line, and that avoids that lure wanting to roll. It's kind of hard to tell looking at the whole picture, but there's a little bit of a simplifying technique. Just take and divide the lure from the front to the back in just equal segments. They don't have to be perfect, and they don't have to be any particular number. Just enough to capture the shape. And I'll come across here, and I'm going to go at that point across the body and find the center point of this body. And that little dot is my center point. And I'm going to do that everywhere, and I'll do that really quickly. And then the final point will be right at the most forward part of the lure, no matter where it falls on, just the most forward part of that lure. And the same thing goes for the tail. Now I've got this center line that sort of matches the general shape of the lure. Alright, and you can see it's got some curvature to it. Some of it is a little off from my drawing. So when I pull this wire across here, all I need to do is eyeball the areas above and below the wire and encompassed by the black line. So now I can just pull it across and eyeball what would be the approximate exact amount. So I think it's right about there with this one, and so that's just on top of that lip. So I would call it right there would be my toe point. Alright, well, that's it for this video. I apologize that we couldn't get it all the way to swim test. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and thank you for all the questions I've been getting. And if you've been asking questions or leaving comments and you're not a subscriber, just have patience, because the YouTube app shows me subscribers' comments and questions first. And once I'm done with those, I get to you guys. Or if you're enjoying these, go ahead and subscribe. I'll catch you on the next video.